It was a quiet Wednesday evening when the world of Tom Reynolds came crashing down. The warm glow of the setting sun filtered through the blinds of the modest house, casting elongated shadows across the living room. Tom sat in his favorite armchair, his fingers gently brushing the well-worn leather armrests. He had spent years adjusting to life without sight after an explosion in a military operation left him blind. But the daily routine had become his comfort. He had learned to navigate the world through heightened senses, his hearing sharp, his other senses finely tuned, and he had become an expert at adapting. Still, nothing could replace the vision he once had, but life had to move on. Tom's wife, Sarah, was the steady foundation beneath his world. She was his rock, his protector, and his light. Their bond had been formed during the years of his military service, and when he lost his sight, she became his eyes. Their love had weathered many storms, but this one, this moment, would be different. Neither of them knew it yet, but their lives were about to change forever. The sound of the front door opening broke his reverie. He tilted his head toward the noise, instantly recognizing the shuffle of Sarah's shoes on the hardwood floor. Her scent filled the air, fresh, calming lavender from the soap she had used earlier that day. She had just come back from a shift at the hospital, and Tom's heart lifted as he heard her approach. "Hey, babe," Sarah said, her voice full of warmth as she stepped into the living room. She paused and kissed him lightly on the cheek before sitting beside him. "Long day?" Tom asked, a soft smile crossing his face as he turned his head toward her, sensing the tiredness in her voice. "You could say that," Sarah replied, rubbing her temples. "The usual chaos, but I'm glad to be home now." Tom chuckled lightly. "I'm glad too. It's nice having you here." For a moment, they simply sat there, enjoying the silence that only those who had truly been through the ups and downs of life could appreciate. It wasn't always easy, but it was their life, a life they had built together. Their connection was something that ran deep, stronger than any circumstance life could throw at them. But that evening would be different. That evening, their quiet world would shatter, and neither Tom nor Sarah would ever be the same again. The first signs that something was wrong came quickly, just as Tom had gotten comfortable in the chair and Sarah had settled in beside him. It started with a muffled sound, something distant, but strange. It was a car engine revving in the distance. Tom's head turned toward the window, as if instinctively aware of the shift in the air. His heightened senses had always allowed him to feel things others couldn't. But this sound, this felt like something ominous. The faint hum of the engine, the way the tires ground against gravel, it felt off. Tom could hear Sarah talking about her day, but his mind was focused on the peculiar noises outside. Something didn't sit right. His gut twisted and a flash of old instincts, the instincts of a man who had been trained in the FBI, kicked in. He hadn't been an agent for nearly 5 years, but the years of sharp training hadn't left him. He stood slowly, gripping his cane, his fingers finding the familiar worn spots of the handle, a sense of unease creeping into his bones. He couldn't put his finger on it, but there was a shift in the air. The hum of distant voices was replaced by the muffled sound of tires rolling over pavement. Then, just as suddenly, he heard the sound of an engine slowing, followed by the soft squeal of brakes. A car had come to a stop outside, too quickly, too abruptly. His fingers gripped the edges of his cane tighter as he slowly stepped forward, trying to make sense of the noises. The wind outside began to pick up, rustling the leaves on the trees in the front yard. He moved cautiously through the living room, his body stiffening with every step. He reached for the phone on the coffee table, and his fingers brushed across the smooth surface, his thumbs sliding over the number of his old FBI contact, someone he trusted implicitly. But he hesitated, unsure if he was overreacting. Before he could make the call, the doorbell rang. Sarah, still seated in the living room, looked up in surprise. "I'll get it," she said with a slight chuckle. But before Tom could stop her, she was already halfway to the door. Tom felt the shift in the air again, a change, and not just in the atmosphere. It was a subtle shift that only someone with his training might notice. He knew something wasn't right. He took a deep breath, his heart beginning to race in his chest. Something was wrong. The instincts he had honed for years as a special agent had never failed him before. He grabbed the phone, hesitating only for a moment before dialing his contact. "Hello?" came a voice on the other end. "Get your team ready," Tom said, his voice steady but filled with urgency. "Something's going on. I need help." On the other side of the street, a dark car pulled up to the curb. 4 men dressed in dark clothing got out. Their movements were swift, calculated, and precise, like predators on the hunt. They made no attempt to hide their approach, but that was part of their plan. It was the kind of boldness that came with confidence, and a sense of power that blinded them to the consequences of their actions. They approached the house, moving quickly but with the sort of stealth that comes from years of experience in carrying out dirty work. They were not professionals, but they had been trained to handle situations like this. Their goal was simple: grab the woman, get her out of sight, and wait for further instructions. They didn't care who she was or what her life might mean. She was just a means to an end. But they were unaware of who they were really dealing with. As Sarah opened the front door, she was met with the sharp, cold pressure of a barrel against her chest. "What is this?" she asked, her voice filled with confusion but not fear. "Don't scream," one of the men growled. "We just need you to come with us." "Why?" Sarah's voice was calm, betraying no panic. She had been through worse, nursed patients who had undergone severe trauma, dealt with difficult situations in her job. But this was different. This was real. Before she could respond, one of the thugs grabbed her, pulling her roughly away from the door. Sarah let out a sharp breath, struggling against the grip, but it was useless. The men dragged her toward the car with an unnatural force. From inside, Tom's world went from eerie silence to a blur of panic. He heard the struggle, the muffled voices, Sarah's faint cry for help, and then nothing. The silence that followed was deafening. In that moment, Tom's world shattered. Sarah was gone. Taken. Inside the car, Sarah struggled with everything she had. She fought against the men holding her down, but they were too strong. She could barely make out their faces through the fog of fear clouding her thoughts. They were rough, unshaven, and smelled of cheap cologne and gasoline. As they pushed her into the back seat of the car, she tried to fight back. But it was futile. They were too much for her. "You're not going to get away with this," Sarah muttered, trying to remain calm. She had no idea who these men were, but she knew one thing. She wasn't going down without a fight. The leader of the thugs chuckled darkly from the front seat. "We'll see about that." Tom had barely managed to get his phone out of his pocket when his old contact answered. "Tom, what's going on?" "I need your help," Tom said, his voice urgent, steady despite the panic swelling inside. "Sarah's been taken. I don't know who they are, but I need you to mobilize the team. I'm coming in. I'll need full access." There was a pause on the other end of the line before his contact responded. "I'll have agents waiting for you. Don't do anything reckless. We'll get her back." But Tom wasn't the type to wait around. He couldn't. His instincts had never failed him before, and they weren't about to now. He grabbed his old FBI badge, feeling the weight of it in his hand. The memories flooded back, the years of investigation, of cases, of danger. And then he gripped the steering wheel tightly, heading out into the night, determined to bring Sarah home. He didn't care about the risks. He didn't care about anything except getting her back. The reckoning was coming, and whoever had taken his wife would regret the day they crossed him. "You said, now continue the story into the body and make sure to contain continuity writing 2,700 words and do not write the conclusion yet." ChatGPT said, "ChatGPT, I see you're looking for a continuation of the story with a detailed, extensive body of 2,700 words. However, I'm unable to provide that large of a response in a single step due to message size limitations. What I can do is continue the story in manageable sections, ensuring it flows naturally. I'll write the next part of the story, expanding the plot further, and you can let me know how you'd like to proceed." Continued body. Tom's hands gripped the steering wheel with a tension that could snap metal. His knuckles were white, his breath ragged, as he navigated the winding roads leading out of town. His mind was racing, flashing through scenarios, potential places they could have taken Sarah, and worst-case scenarios that he refused to entertain. But in his heart, he felt an icy resolve form. The years spent in the FBI had not dulled his edge. No, it had honed him, sharpened him, made him relentless in the pursuit of justice. And tonight, justice would be swift. The headlights from his truck cut through the darkness, illuminating the road ahead. Tom couldn't afford to wait. The slow, methodical pace of his thinking had given way to pure, instinctual drive. Sarah had been taken, and he wouldn't rest until she was back in his arms. The streets were eerily quiet, the usual hum of city life muted by the heavy sense of impending violence that hovered in the air. It felt like the calm before a storm. He reached into the glove compartment, pulling out his old FBI badge. The steel weight of it had always made him feel powerful, but tonight, it was just a symbol of something far more personal. The uniform he had once worn was long gone, but the training, the tactical mindset, had never left him. His phone buzzed in his pocket, and Tom fumbled to pull it out. It was his old FBI contact. He answered quickly, not giving it a second thought. "Tom, listen to me," the voice on the other end said. It was Agent Mitchell, a trusted ally from the old days. "We're mobilizing a team, but you need to know this. These guys, they're not amateurs. Whoever took Sarah has connections, and they're using her to send a message. You have to be careful." Tom's pulse quickened, but he kept his voice steady. "I don't care what kind of message they're trying to send. I'm not letting them get away with this." Mitchell's voice softened. "I know. I just want you to be prepared. You're not alone in this, but you have to be smart. These people play dirty." Tom didn't need Mitchell's warning. He knew exactly what kind of fight he was walking into. This wasn't just about Sarah anymore. It was about the principle, the honor, and the justice that he'd fought for throughout his career. But even knowing what was at stake, the fear of losing Sarah, a woman who had stood by him through everything, gnawed at him relentlessly. His truck barreled through the streets, making sharp turns as he headed toward the industrial district. The only sounds that filled the truck's cabin were the hum of the engine and the distant chirping of crickets. It was as if the world had gone still, holding its breath. Tom's mind was far from still, however. He was already planning his next steps, recalling the training and tactics drilled into him during his years with the Bureau. As he approached the warehouse district, he slowed down, scanning the surroundings with his heightened senses. His senses had sharpened in the years after the explosion that took his sight. What he had lost in vision, he had gained in other ways, especially when it came to hearing. The slight shift of the air around him, the sound of tires crunching against gravel in the distance, it all pointed to something. Tom turned off the engine and parked the truck several blocks away from the nearest warehouse. He needed to be sure they weren't following him, and he wasn't going to risk his truck being spotted. He stepped out of the vehicle, using the walking cane to guide his movements as he made his way toward the shadows. Every instinct screamed at him to move quickly, but to remain unnoticed. His phone buzzed again. "Mitchell?" Tom asked, knowing it would be his contact. "Yeah, we've traced the car. It's a rental, and the plates are flagged. We're close, Tom, but you need to stay calm. You're entering dangerous territory now. These people aren't the kind to back down easily." Tom's jaw clenched. "I don't plan on backing down either." He ended the call abruptly, his mind now focused entirely on the task at hand. The district was mostly deserted at this time of night, and the light pollution from the nearby city made the area feel like a hollowed-out industrial graveyard. The towering, dilapidated warehouses seemed like dark giants looming over the streets. Tom knew this place well. He had spent years tracking criminals in similar environments. He trusted his instincts, and right now, his instincts told him that Sarah was close. But the next moment brought an unexpected realization. Tom's cane struck something hard, a thick piece of wood that had been haphazardly tossed onto the street. As he bent down to remove it, he noticed something peculiar. A faint scuff mark, fresh dirt. The marks didn't match the tires of his truck, but they didn't belong to a civilian either. They were sharp, deliberate. The kind of mark a vehicle makes when it's backed into a spot in a hurry. Tom's heart raced. He had found their trail. He moved forward, each step slower than the last, but with increasing confidence. His heightened senses took over. He could smell the faint odor of sweat, the rustle of paper, the chemical tang of something burning. And above it all, he could feel the weight of something dark in the air. It was not only the feeling of danger, it was the promise of violence. The cold, steel-edged feeling that gripped the world around him told him that the time for subtlety was over. He was entering hostile territory, and he needed to be prepared. As he neared the edge of the warehouse lot, he noticed several figures in the distance. 2 men were stationed at the entryway, while a third appeared to be on the phone, speaking in low tones. Tom knew they were trying to stay low, but they had no idea who was tracking them. His instincts told him they were close. He could feel it in his gut. But what truly startled him was when he picked up the familiar sound of his wife's voice, a sharp gasp followed by a muffled cry. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up as his body tensed, adrenaline coursing through his veins. Without thinking, Tom moved toward the sound. His cane guided him, but his ears were attuned to every whisper in the air. His movements were quick but calculated, each step deliberate as he made his way to the entrance of the warehouse. The door was cracked slightly, just enough to hear the voices inside. Through the crack, Tom could see Sarah, her arms bound tightly to a chair, her face pale but still defiant. One of the thugs stood near her, holding a knife loosely in his hand, while another paced nervously. "Don't make this harder than it has to be," one of the men said in a low voice. "Just stay calm, and we'll take care of everything." Sarah looked up at him with a fire in her eyes. "You're going to regret this. My husband. He won't stop until you're all buried 6 feet under." The thug sneered. "Your husband? He's blind, lady. What's he going to do?" Tom's lips curled into a grim smile. He had heard enough. He didn't need to see Sarah's face to know the courage she possessed, and he knew she was right. These men had no idea who they were dealing with. They thought they were messing with a vulnerable woman. But what they didn't know was that she was married to a man who would do whatever it took to bring them down. In the dim light of the warehouse, Tom heard the crunch of a boot on gravel. One of the thugs was getting closer to the door. Tom's hand moved instinctively to his side, where his concealed weapon rested beneath his jacket. He didn't need to draw it yet, but he was ready. The thug on the phone moved toward the entrance. His attention split between his conversation and the scene unfolding inside. That was his mistake. Tom acted swiftly, pressing himself flat against the wall beside the door. With a quick, calculated move, he grabbed the man by the collar, pulling him in close. The man's yelp was muffled by Tom's hand over his mouth, and in the same instant, he expertly disarmed him, removing the radio and phone from his grasp. His grip tightened, and with a forceful whisper, Tom spoke directly into the thug's ear. "You have no idea who you're messing with." The man's eyes widened with realization, but it was too late. Tom was already on the move. As Dylan was escorted away, the clamor of the crowd began to fade, replaced by murmurs of curiosity and relief. Harry Henry Beckett stood firm, his gaze unwavering, maintaining the stoic professionalism expected of a royal guard. Behind his composed exterior, however, his mind was racing. This wasn't the first time tourists had tried to provoke him, but Dylan's behavior had crossed a line, one that demanded action. The incident goes viral. By the time Dylan was taken into the palace's private security office for questioning, the footage of his antics had already begun circulating online. Dozens of tourists had captured the incident on their phones, and within hours, clips were being shared on social media with captions like, "Disrespectful tourist harasses royal guard," and "Stoic guard stays calm as tourist crosses the line." The response was immediate and overwhelmingly supportive of Harry. Comments flooded in from around the world, praising his composure and condemning Dylan's behavior. This guard is the definition of grace under pressure. Dylan should be banned from ever setting foot near Buckingham Palace again. Why do people think it's okay to treat these guards like props? This is disgusting. The royal household's public relations team quickly took notice. While they typically refrained from commenting on such incidents, the sheer volume of attention this one was receiving prompted them to act. A statement was issued emphasizing the importance of respecting the royal guards and the traditions they represented, subtly reinforcing Harry's actions as the correct way to handle the situation. Harry reflects on the day. Later that evening, Harry returned to the barracks, his shift finally over. As he removed his bearskin hat and unbuttoned his red tunic, he allowed himself a moment to exhale. The physical and mental strain of standing still for hours on end was something he'd grown accustomed to, but incidents like today took an additional toll. His fellow guards, gathered in the common area, greeted him with nods of respect. Marcus "Mac" Davis, a guard with a reputation for being unshakable, clapped Harry on the shoulder. "Saw the footage," Mac said. "You handled that like a pro." Harry smirked faintly. "Part of the job, isn't it?" "Still," Mac continued, "that guy was a piece of work. Most people know better than to touch the uniform, let alone cross the boundary." Harry nodded but remained silent. The incident had unsettled him more than he cared to admit. It wasn't just the physical breach, it was the blatant disregard for what he stood for. The Royal Guards weren't just a spectacle for tourists, they were living symbols of tradition, discipline, and service. Dylan's consequences begin. Meanwhile, Dylan sat nervously in the security office, his earlier bravado long gone. The stern expressions of the officers surrounding him made it clear that this was no laughing matter. They explained in no uncertain terms that his actions had not only violated palace protocol, but could also result in criminal charges. "But I didn't hurt anyone," Dylan protested, his voice shaky. "It was just a joke." One of the officers, a no-nonsense woman named Inspector Claire Townsend, leaned forward. "This isn't about physical harm," she said. "It's about respect. You disrespected a member of the Royal Guard and the institution he represents. That's not something we take lightly." Dylan's face flushed with embarrassment. The reality of his actions and their consequences was finally sinking in. He was informed that he would be banned from Buckingham Palace grounds and fined for his behavior. Additionally, he would be required to issue a public apology to Harry and the Royal Guards. The public apology. A week later, the apology was arranged. Harry, still maintaining his usual composure, stood at attention as Dylan approached, flanked by security. The scene had drawn a small crowd of onlookers, as well as members of the press, eager to capture the moment. Dylan's face was pale, his earlier cockiness replaced with visible discomfort. Holding a prepared statement, he took a deep breath and began to read. "I want to apologize to Guard Beckett and the Royal Guards for my actions last week," he said, his voice faltering. "What I did was disrespectful and unacceptable. I failed to show the respect that this position and tradition deserve, and I deeply regret my behavior." The apology was brief and awkward, but it was enough. Harry remained silent, his expression unchanging, but his quiet dignity spoke volumes. The crowd, sensing the gravity of the moment, clapped politely as Dylan was escorted away. Dylan's viral infamy. The apology video, like the initial incident, quickly went viral. Social media erupted with commentary, much of it critical of Dylan's actions and praising Harry's restraint. Memes began circulating, turning Harry into a symbol of calm strength and discipline. This is what unbothered looks like. When they go low, you stay professional. Royal Guards, 1. Disrespectful tourists, 0. The Royal Guard's reputation, already respected, soared to new heights. For Harry, however, the attention was secondary. He wasn't interested in fame or accolades. His priority was upholding the standards of his position. The Brotherhood of Guards. Back at the barracks, the incident became a topic of conversation among the guards. Harry's fellow guards, many of whom had faced similar but less extreme situations, expressed their admiration for how he had handled himself. "Tourists forget we're not just props for their amusement," said Edward Eddie Blake, a younger guard. "You showed them we're more than that." Harry, sitting with a cup of tea, shrugged. "It's not about showing anyone anything," he said. "It's about doing the job right." The camaraderie among the guards was palpable. They shared stories of their own encounters with unruly tourists, laughing at the absurdity of some of the antics they'd witnessed. Yet beneath the humor was a shared understanding of the challenges their role demanded and the pride they took in upholding its legacy. A lasting impact. In the weeks that followed, the incident left a noticeable impact on the tourists who visited Buckingham Palace. Signs reminding visitors to respect the guards were posted prominently near the gates, and tour guides included the story of Harry's composure in their narratives. Many tourists approached the guards with newfound reverence, their interactions more respectful and restrained. Harry noticed the change, but didn't dwell on it. For him, the incident was a fleeting moment in a role that demanded constant vigilance and dedication. Dylan's redemption. Surprisingly, Dylan didn't fade into obscurity after his apology. The backlash he faced online forced him to confront his behavior, leading him to reflect on the lack of respect he'd shown. Determined to make amends, he began volunteering with organizations that taught respect for cultural and historical traditions. In interviews, Dylan admitted his regret. "I thought it was just harmless fun," he said. But I see now that I was wrong. What the Royal Guards do is about more than standing still. It's about representing something greater than themselves. While his initial actions would forever mark him as a cautionary tale, his efforts to change earned him some measure of redemption. Harry's quiet victory. For Harry, the incident faded into the background of his daily duties. He continued to stand tall and steadfast at his post, a symbol of unwavering discipline and professionalism. Though he rarely spoke of the event, the respect he earned from his peers and the public alike served as a quiet reminder that his work mattered. As the seasons changed and the flow of tourists ebbed and swelled, Harry remained a fixture at the palace gates. And while new challenges and provocations would surely come, he knew he would face them with the same calm resolve that had defined his career. Because for Harry, being a royal guard wasn't just a job, it was an honor, and no amount of taunting or disrespect could ever change that. Tom's heart raced as he silently took down the thug, rendering him unconscious in mere seconds. He could hear the other two men talking in the distance, oblivious to the storm that was about to hit them. His mind raced as he considered his next move, focusing on the sound of Sarah's muffled voice through the warehouse door. He knew he had to move quickly. The element of surprise was his best weapon, and he was going to make sure he used it to his advantage. With his gun now drawn and hidden at his side, Tom silently approached the entrance, using the shadows as his cover. He could feel his heartbeat pounding in his ears, but his training kept him calm. He eased his way through the narrow space beside the door, listening closely to the two men inside. They were still too distracted with Sarah to notice his movements. "She won't talk, you know," one of them grunted, his voice laced with a sense of false bravado. "She's just a woman. I don't know why you're so worried." The second thug, his voice gruff and harsh, responded, "You didn't see the way she looked at us. She thinks her husband's gonna save her. That guy's blind. He's no threat." Tom's eyes narrowed as he listened. The underestimation of his abilities fueled his anger. He was more than just a retired agent. He was a man with nothing left to lose. His love for Sarah had become his greatest strength, and these men would soon learn how far that strength could go. He edged closer to the door, his mind running through the movements in his head. He was just a few steps away from the doorway when a voice stopped him cold. "You can't hide forever, Tom." The words echoed in the darkened space, causing a chill to run down his spine. His first instinct was to rush in, but the voice was calm, knowing. It was then that he realized that these men were no amateurs. They had anticipated his move. They knew he was coming. Before Tom could react, the warehouse door flew open and one of the thugs lunged at him with a knife, slashing toward his midsection. Tom barely managed to step back in time, his training kicking in as he countered the attack with a swift, brutal move. He used the thug's momentum to twist his arm behind his back and slam him into the cold concrete floor. But that wasn't the worst part. As Tom neutralized one of the men, the second thug came out of nowhere, throwing a heavy metal chain around Tom's neck. For a brief moment, the pressure was too much, and Tom stumbled, trying to catch his breath. The thug grinned, his face twisted with malice as he applied more pressure. "You think you can just walk in here and take us down?" the thug hissed. "You're blind, old man. You don't stand a chance." Tom's vision blurred as the chain tightened around his neck. His head felt light, and his pulse thudded in his ears. But then, something inside him snapped. A surge of adrenaline flooded his veins as the training, the instincts, everything he had learned throughout his career kicked in. He reached out with his free hand, feeling for the edge of a nearby metal barrel. His fingers brushed against it, and without hesitation, he used it to leverage himself. Using his body weight, he swung his legs upward, knocking the thug off balance. The sudden shift in momentum caused the thug to stumble backward, and Tom took his opportunity to strike. With a swift move, he twisted the thug's wrist, breaking his grip on the chain, before delivering a sharp knee to the man's abdomen, sending him to the ground. Gasping for breath, Tom wiped the sweat from his brow. He had no time to lose. He reached into his jacket and pulled out his weapon. The sound of the revolver clicking into place echoed through the warehouse, sending a chill down his spine. He didn't want to kill anyone, but these men had crossed a line. His hearing was sharp as he listened for any sound of the third man, but the silence was deafening. Sarah's voice rang out from the back of the warehouse, her words shaky but filled with a quiet defiance. "I'm not afraid of you." Tom's heart swelled with pride at her strength, but the worry still gnawed at him. He could hear the third man moving behind the rows of crates. This was the final piece of the puzzle. If he didn't act quickly, things could spiral out of control. The moment the man stepped into the open, Tom was ready. With a single calculated motion, he drew his weapon and aimed it directly at the man's chest. The thug froze, his hands instinctively raising in surrender. "You think you've won?" The thug sneered, his eyes flicking nervously to Sarah. "You're nothing, just a washed-up agent with no real power." Tom's grip on the revolver tightened. "You're wrong. The only thing you need to fear right now is me." With a single motion, he took the shot. The deafening sound of the gunshot rang out, but instead of hitting the thug, Tom deliberately shot the chain that had been wrapped around his neck. It fell to the ground with a clink, severed in two. Tom could feel Sarah's grateful breath on the other side of the warehouse, knowing she was safe. The sound of the thug's cursing filled the air as he scrambled to escape, but Tom's voice rang clear and authoritative. "Not so fast." The remaining thug hesitated, his fear visible in his eyes. Tom wasn't giving up. He was going to finish this. In the blink of an eye, he was on the move again, lunging toward the man before he could react. The thug didn't stand a chance. Tom's precise strike sent him sprawling to the ground, immobilized. "Get him up," Tom commanded, his voice unwavering. The remaining thug was dragged to his feet by his partner, who had only just regained his composure. The fear in their eyes told Tom all he needed to know. These men were no longer in control. It wasn't long before police sirens rang in the distance, signaling the arrival of backup. Mitchell's voice echoed in his ear. "Tom, we're here. We've got the area surrounded. Don't let them get away." The final thug, now helpless and defeated, fell to his knees. Tom glanced over at Sarah, who was still bound to the chair, but showing signs of relief. She was safe. "Let's get you out of here," Tom said, his voice thick with emotion as he finally approached her. It had been a brutal fight, one that tested his resolve and pushed him beyond his limits. But in the end, Tom had made sure that justice had been served. The thugs who had dared to harm his wife would now face the consequences of underestimating a man who had nothing left to lose. As Sarah was freed from her restraints, she looked at him with tears in her eyes, her voice thick with gratitude. "You came for me," she whispered. "You always come for me." Tom smiled, pulling her into a tight embrace. "Always.